Good evening, and welcome to our fourth session of Conversations from the Capital. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Fatema Sumar. The objective of Conversations from the Capital is to highlight American Ismailis who have had the opportunity to work in local, state, or federal politics or policy. My name is Zach Karim, and I am the member for Communications and Publications on the Northeast Council. Fatema Sumar comes to us today from Oxfam America. She has served in various positions in government. She served as Regional Deputy Vice President for Europe, Asia Pacific, and Latin America at the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia at the U.S. Department of State. She was also a senior staffer on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee focused on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Finally, she was also a Presidential Management Fellow at the State Department. I know tonight we are going to learn a lot from Fatema. Our moderator tonight is Jamil Jaffer. Jamil is founder and executive director, National Security Institute, George Mason University Law School. Formerly, Jamil was the chief counsel and senior advisor, Senate Foreign Relations, as well as former associate counsel for President George W. Bush. As a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function in Zoom. And lastly, if you would like to enjoy this webinar seeing both speakers, please use the gallery mode. With no further ado, I will pass it over to Jamil. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks, Fatema, for being here and joining us tonight. Right up at the front, I just want to note for the audience that even though this conversation is going to be recorded, and it's being conducted under the Chatham House rules, and you're only speaking for yourself in your personal capacity. You're not representing any current or former employer. So that's the preliminaries. So Fatema, over the past few weeks, we've been talking to people like Amira Valiani, who worked at the White House National Security Council under President Obama, Sophia Lalani, who worked for Senator Cory Booker, Ambassador Sada Cumber, who was the first ever special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Countries. And I normally start out by asking them, what their favorite story was, that moment that sort of be like, I can't believe I'm here. But we're going to try a different approach this time. We're going to go a little more chronological order so people get a sense for who you are and hear about the amazing things you've done in your career, like running U.S. foreign policy towards South and Central Asia, managing $4 billion worth of U.S. investments around the globe. How did this whole thing start for you?
Well, hi, Jamil. So first, just to say, I'm so excited to be here, and thanks so much for having me on. It's great to see so many members of the Jamaat across the US, Canada, and wherever you're calling in from. So thank you for all taking the time during this busy week to join us today. And I just want to congratulate first you, Jamil, and Zach, and Asma, and the whole team. It's so great to see Conversations from the Capital coming together and really helping us connect each other, our stories, and really our future, right? And our future potential here in the US. So just congratulations to you guys, and thanks so much for having me on. So I guess, I'm a really, my story is not that typical, I think, in some ways. I didn't really grow up with a vision of this is what I want to do, or like I'm going to be a lawyer or an engineer or a teacher. I really kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. But I was really impacted by the way I grew up in terms of being an immigrant to the United States, having ties both here in the US, but also overseas with family in India and Malaysia, and just always feeling this very strong connection, both as we tried to figure out finding our family's footing here as immigrants in the US, but also trying to figure out how do we carry that identity and connect it with what is happening overseas. And so that always really stuck with me. And even growing up, I was always interested in things like history, social studies, debate, model United Nations, really trying to understand, I think our place in this world and what is our place in this world. And I think that's how it really started back as a child. I've had a career, I've been really, really blessed. I just want to say I've been incredibly fortunate and blessed. I've had a career covering national security, foreign policy, and now international development. And the truth of the matter is, Jamil, I've kind of stumbled upon it in every single way, and just opportunity to opportunity that opened different doors. And I was excited to try new challenges. So I started my foreign policy career with the State Department, as you mentioned, coming out of graduate school, took a turn left to the Hill, took a turn right, back to the State Department, to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and then finally left government and joined an international INGO at Oxfam America. So that's where I've started, and that's where I've ended up today.
Yeah. So take us back to the beginning. You know, so you're growing up. You were the oldest. Your mom raised you on her own. Tell us how that played out. Girl Scouts played a big role in your life. Like, tell us how you sort of grew up and how you ended up going to Cornell.
Great. So we're gonna go there, Jamil. We had, growing up, my father passed away when I was a teenager, so he had a really big impact on my life. But unfortunately, my mom was put in the position of having to raise 4 girls on her own as a single mom. And that played a big role. I always joke that I felt like I was like 30 or 40 by the time I was 15. A lot of responsibility to help raise my siblings, to figure out my education, high school, college, and the like. And, part of the ethos that I think Islam brings to our lives, our faith brings, and part of our ethos, I think, growing up, that was really important to me was public service. We were really fortunate when my dad passed away that so many of our friends, our neighbors, community members stepped in to help us out. And I'll always remember that. We did so well, and we're so incredibly blessed, my sisters and I, because of my mother, my family members, my extended family members. But we're so blessed because people took time out of their lives to help us out and to help us finish our schooling, get us to our activities, feed us sometimes. And, I've always believed in also being able to contribute and to paying it forward.
Yeah.
And so one of the most tangible ways for me was through Girl Scouts, which is what I did growing up. And I started out as a brownie and went all the way up the ranks to a senior. One of the most memorable experiences I had as my first diplomatic experience actually is when I was 14 years old, and I traveled as a representative of the Girl Scouts USA on a diplomatic mission at the time to Malaysia to look at water and environmental issues. And that was actually my first diplomatic mission. And
at 14?
At 14, and Girl Scouts helped do that for me. And I had a brownie troop with some friends in high school where we actually ran brownies for about 4 or 5 years. And it was actually my first foray into leadership, into organization, NGO management, all of these things that we know that public service can teach us really early on.
Right. So then you go to Cornell, and was the plan always to go work in foreign policy? What was your plan at graduation?
Yeah. So when I graduated, so I studied political science, international relations. I studied abroad in Cairo. I was studying Arabic at the time. I was really excited to actually get started on a foreign policy career. Unfortunately, when I graduated, I remember my mom always gave me this piece of advice. She said, just take the first job you get. She's like, I don't know what you're doing here, there, and whatever. Just take the first job you get. And remember, Jamil, we're going to outdate ourselves here for the crowd, but this is when the internet was still kind of figuring itself out, and job searches were still in the library looking for books and applying to employers, right? Remember that?
I do.
So one of the first very nascent websites back in the day, and now it's a sophisticated engine, but back in the day was idealist.org, which was a website, which is still active today, that helped you forge careers in the NGO world and in public service. And so I think I applied to every single job I could find there. And I took my mom's advice. I took the first job I got, and it was with the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and it was to help them launch a new national drug policy litigation project. And I didn't know anything about any of that, but I was excited to learn. And I have to say, even to this day, it's one of the best jobs I've ever had, because I learned to run everything. I learned how to be everything from an intern to a secretary to a fundraiser to a writer. And sometimes it's those early jobs that you have right out of college. It may not even be what you studied or what you're super passionate about, but when you work for good leaders and good bosses who just teach you, and if you're willing to learn and do anything, they can be some of the best experiences you have of your entire career. So I actually started out in domestic policy issues, on drug policy and racial justice issues. Very, very far cry from my foreign policy world years later.
Yeah, but really relevant today, you know. So it's interesting. You mentioned something about this idea of, you know, being lucky to work for good leaders and doing good work for them, right? And something about being available when there's that opportunity to work on something, then running right at it. Tell us a little bit about that. What, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people on the line here today who's listening and hearing what you're saying and saying, well, how do I become like her? Like, she went to this job and she got lucky, she got a good leader, but then what do you do with that? Like, what do you mean by like be there and do good work? What does that look like?
You know, one of the things that I think faith teaches us that's very powerful is humility. And what I mean by that in the professional sense is having the humility at any level you're at, and certainly when you're entering right into the job market after college, to say, I'm actually really willing to do anything. It doesn't have to be this big, exciting, you know, job. I can be, you know, my first 6 months on that job, I worked out of my boss's attic and not even in an office because we didn't have money yet and we were still fundraising. Right. I spent time going to Staples and buying office supplies. I ran to the deli every day at lunchtime to pick up food for the office. I did everything from like running errands to actually getting fundraising proposals online, getting office space when we had enough money, setting up the office, really nuts and bolts things. It had nothing to do with what I studied. In some ways, it wasn't even connected to my, you know, my education, but it was this real opportunity to say, what does it take? What's a startup like? What is it actually like to start something up? And do I like it? Am I good at it? Is it something I enjoy? And it teaches you so much about yourself. So I think, you know, when you have an opportunity, sometimes it may not be what you were thinking. It may take you off path, but actually strengthen your path forward in unexpected ways years down the road. And I think the key always is be really open, be really humble, and say, if an opportunity presents itself and I can see some value in it, I'm going to try my best and see what I can take from it.
Awesome. So you're working at the ACLU. How do you end up in foreign policy? Do you go back to grad school? Like, what do you do? Did you intern somewhere? What did you do?
Yeah. So, you know, the catch-22, right? When you graduate from school and you get in, you know, whatever sector you're getting into, and you're really passionate about something and you try to apply for jobs. So I really wanted to, after a few years, I wanted to get back into the foreign policy world. Yeah. But of course, no one really wants to hire you because you don't have any experience. Right. And you're saying, I'm trying to get experience.
Right. Hello.
So it can be really hard to navigate this. And for me, I decided getting another job in foreign policy at that point was competitive. I wasn't really competitive for it. And so I decided to go back to school. Okay. And at that point, I thought I'd go to law school because, you know, I didn't do engineering, I didn't do medicine. So, you know, law school is left. So I thought to myself, I'll apply to law school. Right. And I thought that's what you know, in many ways, I thought that's what I was going to be doing even since I was a young kid. And so as I was applying to schools, I remember still to this day, one of my favorite professors, Mary Katzenstein, was kind enough to write me a letter of recommendation. And when I called her, she said, Fatima, what do you really want to do? Like, what do you actually want to do with the degree? Like, you're so focused on the degree, but what do you want to do when you get the degree? And I said, I want to change laws. I want to change policy. That's what I want to do. I want to actually change our system of the way we think about things. Right. So she said, you don't need to go to law school for that. You need to go to policy school for that. And I had no clue what that was. I had
like, what am I going to tell my mom if I go to policy school? Like, what is that?
Right. I didn't know what that was. And, I didn't really have the benefit of having a lot of mentors at that time. I didn't really understand my graduate school options. I knew like the big three, law, medicine, engineering. But out of that, we weren't really trained, to understand all of the options that the American education system would offer us.
Yeah. No, so because our parents thought there were no other options. Those were the options. There's no other options.
I mean, my dad was an engineer. My mom's a doctor, Right,
there you go.
So that was really pivotal advice for me. And so I started looking to what that was. What were policy schools? And as I started digging deeper, I realized there were many schools that actually had dual. They had both domestic and international policy within the same school. Right. And I thought, oh, that could be something really interesting. I can apply as a domestic student and then see if they'll let me take classes on the international side, or at least be able to kind of, dabble a little bit in both.
Yeah. Run the bait and
And
switch.
so I identified, I think it was like 5 schools that had both that I thought were strong programs. I was really fortunate to have a few to choose from. And, one piece of advice I give to people listening out there is that some of them, have great scholarship programs and great scholarship opportunities, especially if you're really serious and have shown a dedication towards the public service track. So at the end, I was looking at the Harvard Kennedy School and then Princeton Woodrow Wilson School, and they both had terrific scholarship opportunities.
Yeah.
I decided to attend the Woodrow Wilson School, and I'll tell you a funny story. When I went for their admissions weekend for students, I spoke with the admissions dean, who, of course, I was like, now I think he's one of my closest friends, and he's such an angel. But I didn't know him back then, and
Right.
I went into his office and I said, I want to be really honest with you. I know I got accepted as a domestic policy student, but I really want to do international policy. But I don't want to lie. I feel like, I just feel like I want to start out clean if I come to the school. And he marched me into his office and he was very stern about it. And he said, we should talk. And my heart kind of dropped and I thought, oh my God, I blew it. I just blew it. I should have just, kept my mouth quiet and just started the program, accepted the offer.
Right.
We went into his office and he pulled up a spreadsheet of all the admission students and he found my name. And I thought he was going to delete me from the spreadsheet.
Right.
And I was, I was so nervous. And instead at Woodrow Wilson, they have it by fields. Field 1 is international, field 3 is domestic. And so I was in it as a Roman numeral 3. And he said, he went into that box and he says, push the delete key twice. And I did, and then I became a field 1 student. And so that's
awesome.
how I switched careers from domestic to international.
That's wild.
And, he said something to me that always stuck, and it's the advice I pay forward every time I mentor others. He said, we don't care here what you're going to work on. You can work on international, you can work on national, local, federal, community, pick your level. He's like, we want to invest in people that are going to be leaders in public service. And leadership is not by geography or scope. Leadership is when you believe in a mission and you think you can help change it for the better. And he's like, those are the people we want to invest in. And he's like, if you see that in yourself, we see that in you.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. So we're about to get into your career, but I want to remind the audience that in about 20 minutes or so, we're going to take your questions. So please go ahead, start putting your questions in the Q&A field down there, and we'll get to them in about 20 minutes. And we will end right on time at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock West Coast. So definitely give us your questions. So look, so you go to Princeton, and you get this great degree in policy, and then you're ready to get out. And what happens next? You get an amazing job in the government. What happens?
Yeah. So I actually thought I'd go to NGOs coming out of graduate school. That's what I thought I was going to be doing. And, that's where my passion, I got there, but it took me 15 years to get there. But I got more great advice along the way. Look for mentors, look for really good professors, look for alum who have good advice in any program that you're at. And one of the things that I learned is that it's really, really difficult to get into certain sectors, and there's only on-ramps during certain parts of your career. Okay. So for an example, to get into the US government, there are certain entry points where it's just easier, right? Coming out of college, because they have programs for seniors. Coming out of grad school, they have certain fellowships. I think the World Bank, the IMF, they're similar, right? In terms of career trajectory paths. So they said, you can always get into the NGO sector, but it's really difficult. If you ever want to try serving in government, try now.
Early on.
Out of grad school, early on, because you have multiple fellowship opportunities. So I applied for 2 different ones. I applied for the White House Fellows and I applied for the Presidential Management Fellows. Got really close on the White House Fellows as a national finalist, but didn't make it all the way. And then I applied for the PMF and was able to get that. And I chose the State Department as my home office. And the PMF is a great, if any of you are interested in public policy and you're in grad school, you could be in law school, you could be in public policy school. It's a great 2-year fellowship in the US government. You find a home agency that'll house you for 2 years, and then you can do 2 rotations, actually anywhere. It doesn't even have to be in government. And so I went to the State Department as my home agency, and then I did 2 different rotations, one at the US Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, and then the second on the Hill, working for Senator Casey on his foreign policy agenda.
So let's just talk about this for a second. So your first job right out of grad school was in the State Department. Was it at the South and Central Asia Bureau?
Mm-hmm.
So you went from being essentially, a fellow or intern, whatever you want to call it, right, as your first job, and we're going to fast forward at some point to the story about you ended up running that office. Pretty crazy if you think about it.
Well, I actually started out as an intern there in between my first and second year of grad school. I interned in the bureau on the Afghanistan desk as an intern.
Wild.
And then I made connections there, which helped me get the fellowship.
Oh, is that right?
And my placing because of the relationships that I built during my internship. Right. And then I was housed in the SCA, the South Central Asia Bureau. And then many years later, I came back. I didn't quite run the bureau, that was our assistant secretary, but I was
close enough for government.
One of our deputy assistant
Functionally, you ran it day to day. Day to day, functionally, you ran it.
And I was responsible for our regional economic and security human rights policy for the region.
Yeah. So this, it's pretty amazing to me. So you go to Kabul, right? So you got these great experiences, right? You go to the Hill, and then what happens next? How does it play out? How do you end up at this senior job at State Department?
Mm-hmm. So I finished the fellowship after 2 years. I loved the Hill. I loved working in the U.S. Senate. It really spoke to me. It was a really good fit for my personality. I liked how you just kind of were very entrepreneurial in many ways as a staffer. Yeah. So when I finished the fellowship, the November 2008 election happened, right? And Obama wins the election. The inauguration happens, and you know what's happening, right? In these big elections, everyone's trying to get into the administration.
Right.
And so another piece of advice I get good pieces of advice from people. They said, when everyone's trying to go this way, you should go that way. Okay. So there's an exodus of people, of jobs, in other places, because everyone's leaving their jobs to try to get into the Obama administration.
Right.
So as the Obama administration came in, I left and I found a job on the Hill. And so after Biden, you'll remember, was back then was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Yes.
And when he became vice president-elect, there was an opening on Senate Foreign Relations. And it goes in sequential order, as you know, and I think it was Chris Dodd was next in line, but we had a financial crisis, so he stuck with the committees in charge of that on banking.
Right.
And then next in succession for SFRC was John Kerry. And so he was putting a team together in December, and I got a call really kind of randomly from his chief of staff. I went in, that's a whole other story, but I went in for an interview with him, didn't really know him, or I didn't have relationships with Senator Kerry at the time. With his office, and anyway, within a couple weeks, had an offer to help him staff up his new committee, and it was a leap of faith for me at the time because he didn't know at that time he wasn't yet chairman, right? This was December. He'd get the chairmanship in January.
Right.
He didn't know what the budget was going to be. He didn't know how many people, how many staff were going to leave to go into the administration. So he didn't know how many openings he'd have. He didn't know the salaries were going to be. Like, everything was up in the air, and it was just, if you want to be on my team coming in and take a leap of faith, join. If you don't, I totally understand. And I remember I talked to my husband, and I was like, it's a huge leap of faith to leave a civil service job, right? Where you have you're getting paid, you're getting benefits, you're protected. I know I'll get promoted through the ranks over the years. To go to this job where I don't even know, am I a secretary? Am I a policy person? It's so undefined. It's, there's very few women, very few people of color. Yeah. I have no clue what I'm signing up for, but it could be really cool. And I decided, you live once. Yeah. I'm going to try. And I took a leap of faith. That was my biggest leap of faith in my career, was switching and leaving a civil service job. And it was awesome. I loved it. Yeah. I loved it.
So tell us, what is it like working at the committee? They, these members go on these crazy trips around the world and go see things. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee has a lot of responsibility. You're his key staffer on a set of issues, right? You're traveling with him. Talk to about, where did you go? What did you do? Who did you see? What was it like being a Muslim woman traveling to the Middle East with, white patrician John Kerry, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee? What was that like?
Well, we have the scene set because these were the years after 9/11. This was at the height. I mean, we were on the committee. I joined the committee in 2009. We were at the height of the war in Afghanistan at the time, right? We were in war in Iraq. I mean, we were just wars everywhere. I mean, our whole foreign policy at that point and national security policy was about, US wars in the Middle East and in South Asia. We were constantly trying to figure out the relationship with Pakistan. And
Right.
so, you know, I entered my domain was South and Central Asia policy for SFRC. And it became, you know, what that meant every single day was Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? That's where the action was at. And so we spent a lot of time on planes. I mean, I think I spent many hours on little military planes from Doha or Dubai Air Force bases that shuttle you into Kandahar or Helmand or Kabul in the middle of the night, or Islamabad or Lahore. And you know, a lot of it was really trying to figure out, to work in really close relationship with our US ambassadors, our US diplomatic community, the foreign diplomatic community, the United Nations, and really try to figure out, you know, Senator Kerry at the time, and, you know, now Secretary Kerry, but at the time, he was really, he grew up through the Vietnam experience. That's how he came of age, right, politically speaking. And so he was really, alongside then President Obama, really focused on getting US troops out safely, but leaving the region behind in a way that wouldn't be destabilizing. And, you know, we spent years trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we bring casualties down? How do we not destabilize the region? How do we think about human rights protection for Afghan women, for Pakistani women? How do we think about foreign aid, diplomatic assistance, development assistance? And so it was, it really was a whirlwind. I was so honored and blessed and privileged to have the opportunity to be in, you know, meetings with heads of state and foreign ministers and finance ministers, sometimes just scribbling and taking notes and trying to figure out what it all meant, and or turning it into an op-ed that we could do to convince Americans of why we were here in the first place when we returned home, or to explain to families that had lost loved ones because they were veterans of the war and they had died. You know, a lot of this was really trying to also connect the story of what happens overseas with our populations here at home.
Right.
And yeah, I learned a lot. My one of my favorite personal moments of that was when we were in New Delhi in India, and we were in the presidential palace of then President Singh. And I thought, you know, it's one of those moments, and he came over to speak to me at the very end, and, you know, he said, you know, where are you from? And when I told him that, you know, my family is originally from Gujarat, he started speaking to me in Gujarati. And it was just one of those surreal moments you have in your life that, like, you know, my parents grew up in relative poverty, really like a lot of hard struggles, especially for my dad growing up in India. And, you know, he had passed away, but to know that his daughter was meeting with the president of India, you know, many years later, it was just like one of those really surreal moments. And just, you know, how blessed we are.
Yeah. So you're at these meetings, and you've got the president of India, you've got Hamid Karzai, Ashraf Kayani, right, the former head of ISI, the chief of staff of the army. Talk to us about, like, what happens at those meetings, like, what's it like? What can you give us a sense of what's going on there? Are people having real conversations, or is it all just set pieces? What happens in those conversations?
You know, diplomacy is all about relationships, right? So I've done the whole gamut. I mean, I've been with different you know, senators or senior administration officials, where if you don't really have a relationship with that official, then the meetings are pretty staged, I would say. They're pretty formal. Like, if they have 5 people on their side, we have 5 people on our side. And there's a lot of scripted talking points on both sides. And you're not really, you know, you say what you came to say, they respond with what they knew, and you could kind of script the whole meeting almost before it even took place, right? I used to always joke, why don't I just exchange our TPs with their TPs and just write up the notes before the meeting is going to happen, right? But when you have real relationships, and that's what diplomacy is, and a really good diplomat, and you know, the United States we're tremendous. We have such great diplomats in our both foreign service and in our political administrations. A really good diplomat builds relationships over time. It's why face-to-face is so important. It's why getting to know your teams is so important. And when you're in those moments, and I was in many of those moments with people I worked for, then it's small groups. Usually they're small group settings, right? They're not like that huge rectangle table in between you always. You're more, you know, you're closer. It's a smaller group, and you're really having a dialogue and conversation to try to understand, why can't you do whatever it is we're trying to do? Why is it so hard? What is the stumbling block? Where's the mistrust, right? Because trust is always such a thing when we talk about these relationships. And oftentimes, as I was a staffer, particularly in SFRC and then in the State Department, the job switches a little bit as you're more in a more official position versus the staffer behind the scenes. But on SFRC, a lot of times my job was the note taker. So I'd sit there and I was usually the last, by rank, the last person there. And you're scribbling notes and you're literally trying to transcribe what are they saying? What are they not saying, but they're really saying, so that we can, cable back to Washington. What's their body language? Are they tense? Like you're really trying to read the situation. Maybe sometimes the real action's not even here and you're talking to other staff behind the scenes to say, well, what is your boss really thinking? What is he really worried about? It's almost always men, I'll just say, like almost always you're with men. I was usually one of the very few females on both sides in the room. Almost always I think I was always the, single female Muslim staffer for either side. Very, different to have women because it's a largely male dominated space for the most part. And when I was at the State Department and then MCC and I was taking more of those meetings myself, then I would say your role as the principal, then your role really is to do your homework really well. So I'd say, I used to fly often, I think I was on planes nonstop for most of my government diplomatic career. And it's your homework. Like when you land in a capital, sometimes I'm only there for 24 hours. And it could be meeting with like the Philippines finance minister or the foreign minister of Mongolia or whoever you're meeting with, but there's a specific ask we're there for. And have my teams done the homework to justify when we land, we think we can move the deal to the next place and we can get to the next hurdle. To do that, sometimes you just have to build up a relationship. So in the beginning, for me, it was often building up my own relationships so that when I needed to go in for an ask, it wasn't coming out of thin air. And so there really is like the art of diplomacy that even for my career in international development, it's been one of the reasons that I think I've done well is that I can use the diplomatic angles to really help us get to the deal.
So to be clear, so you're at the Foreign Relations Committee, you're taking these notes, these meetings, but you're also developing policy for Senator Kerry. Then he goes to be Secretary of State, right? And you go with him, right? To the State Department.
Not initially, right because
talk to us about that. What happened? How'd that play out?
Well, at that point, I'd already been at the State Department twice in my career, and I had three young kids. And so for any of you that worked at the State Department, it's really not easy to have young children and work at the State Department. So I was thrilled when he got the nomination, and then when he was appointed as secretary, I initially actually didn't go, and I stayed and I worked for the incoming chairman, Senator Menendez. And life on the Hill was actually, for me, with three young kids, it was a good mix for me. And I lived right on the Hill, so it was easy to go back and forth. I was in close touch with the teams at the State Department. They kept asking me to come, and I said, "Oh God, it's gonna be so hard." I mean, I was really concerned about the kids, and travel and just my lifestyle and how hard it was gonna be. And I did call a few mentors, and they said to me, I said, "Well, what do I do? Do I take the opportunity, or do I let it go and hope it comes around again?" And they said, the problem in Washington with these careers is that you just never know, it could be that this is it, this is your opportunity, or maybe it comes around 15 years from now, you just don't know. But, you could try it, set a term limit to yourself of like 2 years or something and see how it goes. And so extensive conversations, of course, with my husband and my family. And then many months later, I decided to make the jump and go back for a third time back to the State Department.
So you're at the State Department now, and you're traveling around the world, 35,000 miles, or some crazy, whatever, 100,000 miles, whatever, some crazy amount of miles. And you're meeting with heads of state, foreign ministers, right, of the country, right? You're going to, and you are, along with the ambassador for that country, the representative of the United States in those meetings. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what are you negotiating? Like what are the conversations about?
Yeah. So oftentimes they were about things like our economic policy. Maybe we were trying to establish new trade deals. Maybe we were trying to figure out issues that U.S. companies were facing and trying to understand what the blockage was. A lot of tough conversations. My part of the world was South and Central Asia when I was at State. It's a lot of tough conversations on human rights and making sure that we were really advocating for free and fair elections, democracy, freedom of speech, making sure journalists were protected. So a lot of human rights issues. I spent a lot of time on economic policy. One of the things I was really passionate about was securing a regional trade zone all the way from Central Asia through Afghanistan and Pakistan down into the subcontinent and eventually into Southeast Asia. Because, you know, what most people don't realize is that South Asia, so that part of the world, is the least connected part of any part of the world. People think it's Africa or other places. It's not. It's actually the Indian subcontinent is the least connected part of the world, right? And largely because of the political dynamic between India and Pakistan, which means that you don't have free trade of people, goods. The borders are shut down most places. You don't have air travel, right? I mean, every time I traveled all around Central Asia, instead of just hopping between each of the stans, from going to Kabul to Dushanbe or Bishkek or, you know, wherever, you have to go back to Istanbul every single time because the trade routes don't exist, right? And so things that we take for granted in other parts. And so we spent a lot of time thinking through what we called the New Silk Road at the time. But the idea was really about people, customs, trade, goods, borders, infrastructure. So could we get regional energy grids going? You know, poor countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are flush with potential on hydropower, for instance. If they can figure out an economic grid, an economic way to export that surplus energy into Kabul, into Islamabad, and down into the Indian subcontinent where India is so thirsty for power, think about how you could literally turn the lights on, powering the lights in the subcontinent. So spending a lot of time with the World Bank, with the IMF and others, also trying to figure out, can we put deals together that actually really could have a profound impact at scale, right? Because the populations that we're talking about are so big.
And that's amazing. You're literally talking about how the U.S. can use its foreign policy power to essentially create a new trade route that enables sort of economic development for a whole swath of the world. It's pretty amazing. I do want to get to the story about the $4 billion you control when you were at MCC. But before we do that, let's take some questions from the audience. I see we've got a few questions down there. And for the folks that want to add some, just feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat thing, and we'll get to them just as soon as we can. Mohammed Donadina asks, what is the most fun thing you've done in your career so far?
That's a good question. My most fun one, actually, when I was at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, I ended up traveling to Mongolia a lot, and I'd never been to Mongolia up to that point. And my first trip to Mongolia was actually my first week on the job at MCC. And I accompanied our CEO, and we spent a lot of time, you know, having our official meetings in Ulaanbaatar, the capital. But then we decided to take a break for a few days, get out of the capital, and see what life was like for rural communities. And Mongolia is a very nomadic culture still, 50%. There's more cattle and livestock than people in Mongolia. 50% of the population lives in Ulaanbaatar and Ubi. And so we did a caravan with the US ambassador in these Jeeps outfitted for any type of terrain and harsh weather. And there was a caravan, I think, of like 6-7 cars, I can't remember. And we went off-road for 3 days through the Gobi Desert, and we just drove in sand. I had no clue. There's no cell phones, no satellite. We were literally off-grid. I had no clue how the drivers knew where we were going. I kept asking the drivers, but they didn't speak English. I kept saying, how do you know where we're going? And they said, we follow the sun. And I was like, but the sun is everywhere. What does that mean? And literally, like, we saw more camels than people. We slept out in the open air of the Gobi Desert for 3 nights.
Whoa.
And it was just, and, you know, we met rural communities living nomadic lives. You know, they're all nomads along the way. So they live with the gers, you know, the yurts. I got to spend a night. I got to spend a night in a ger, which was my first time doing that, which was incredible. Drinking camel's milk and goat's milk, and
how
really
was that?
seeing what that was like.
Yeah, no, okay.
Not my cup of tea.
Right.
But yeah, it was just so. It was like one of those timeless trips, and really felt very remote and amazing that even in the most far-flung corners of literally the world, how excited people were to talk to the delegate, you know, to the United States, and to hear what we had to say, and had messages for us to take back, you know, even in such remote, hard to reach areas.
Ibrahim in Yatli asks, how did your South Asian background either help or hinder your role working on South and Central Asia policy? Did you have personal views and personal biases on the policies, and how did that play in with what your boss, whether it was at Senator Secretary Kerry at SFRC, or the president or Secretary Kerry when he was Secretary of State? How did your personal views play in, and how did your background either help or hinder you in your job?
Yeah. So I don't think I brought a lot of overly personal biases, professionally speaking. I'm really careful and cognizant to kind of not let that interfere with what I think is in the interest of whoever I'm working for, and in those jobs, the American people. But I think one of the things, again, to scene set, I mean, this was like, we are 9/11 kids, right? We are 9/11 babies. We grew up in the aftermath of 9/11. And the conversation for, probably 2 decades after 9/11 has been around what is the role of Islam on the global stage, and certainly in places like the Middle East and in South Asia. And I think because I'm Muslim, because I'm from South Asia ethnically, I was often thrust into this role of having to explain everything, even though I'm not a theologian. I didn't study Islamic studies professionally. I mean, what I practice personally, but it's not that I am a professionally, that's what I've studied. And I was often kind of thrust in that kind of interpreter role.
Tell us about Islam. You're Muslim. You must know everything about Islam, right?
And so,
tell us what it's like.
How do we, what are Sunnis? What are Shias? Why do they fight each other? Like all of these basic one-on-one questions. And so I remember, I think I was telling this to Jamil, like I used to, even when I was back in the Senate, I would get all these questions thrown at me, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know the answer. And I would email like Hussein Rashid and say, Hussein, what's the answer to this question? Because he's someone who really studies this and knows it. And he knows it. And then he would say, oh, tell him this. And I'm like, okay, great, thank you. And I go feed it in. So I think you often get put into this role of being the ambassador for your culture, for your faith, or for an entire subcontinent, right? Which is funny because it's not like, we represent a slice. We certainly don't know or represent everything. And so that was a really, in some ways though, it's a huge opportunity, right? I mean, for me, I capitalized on that in the sense of, I said, all right, like if you want to learn, I will help you learn. I will help you learn. And I may not know the answers, but I certainly know people who do, and I can connect that information. And so one of the most concrete ways I did that is when the roles that we had, that you and I both had on the Senate, you get to help put together a lot of hearings, right, for the members of the committee. And so I think I put together about 40 hearings during my time there. And I was really cognizant of the power I had to call different type of witnesses. So people that may look more like us or may not look like the typical person that always testifies. And I was always trying to find women, people of color, diverse views who, who don't always have those opportunities because power is so tightly controlled, in the US Senate. And so that to me was one of my proudest moments in the Senate. It was about using my power to open the door for others, to let them have voice and representation. And I think that wasn't always easy for the members of the committee because they're used to witnesses looking a certain way.
Like them.
And when they don't look like them, it can be a little awkward, and it can say, like, why are they qualified to speak on something if and so there were some moments I know we've had that could be contentious sometimes behind the scenes, because I would bring women, for instance, to testify on the Taliban and their military tactics in the South. And I remember one senator said to me once, behind the scenes, he said, Fatima, I don't understand why you invited her to testify. This is not a hearing about women's issues. And I said, no, I get that. I know this is a military expert hearing, and women can talk about that too. And they were like, well, are there men that can talk about that? And I was like, there are, and there's this supremely qualified person to be able to do that too. So those were the kind of like behind the scenes battles that I spent a lot of time on.
Yeah, so Nisar Giovanni asked a related question, right, about as a woman of color, did you find you ran into any obstacles in your career, whether with coworkers or bosses? How did you manage that, whether abroad or at home? And sort of to add to that, you also talked, about the challenges you faced dealing with family, right? 3 kids at home and your husband. And how did you manage, one, being a woman of color in a predominantly white male U.S. Senate, right? Exception here and there, but that's largely the rule. And what was it? Was it a challenge? Did you face challenges, or how did you manage it?
Well, I'm still trying to figure it all out. So
Okay.
just to say, I'll take the mom question first. I'm incredibly blessed. I have an incredible husband, an incredible family, extended family. When the kids were young, between my mom and my mother-in-law, they really saved me on so many occasions, especially when I was traveling, and neither one of them lived near me. My in-laws, my mother-in-law would fly all the way in from Calgary to save me so that I could go off to do this thing here, or my mother would take time off her job to fly in, to drive in from New Jersey. So really, just incredible, that I was able to rely on this support network. My sisters were really incredible in helping me out, especially when the kids were younger. So just to say that it's not me, myself. I don't want to even pretend to take any credit for it. It's been my husband, it's been my family, my extended family, and friends. So that's been this support network, and a lot of it's just survival. And I don't try to think more than a week ahead, because your brain hurts,
right,
of how you do that. And then I would say, on the navigating the career spaces, Washington, as many of you know, many of you who work there or have had careers or jobs there, it's not just the Senate, it's the State Department, it's NCC, it's USAID, it's Treasury, it's most of our government agencies. Diversity can be really, really tough, right? Even when you have diversity, it doesn't mean that you have equal voice or equal power. It doesn't mean that you're taken seriously. When I was at State, I was quite young compared to some of the people I was working with were U.S. ambassadors who just weren't used to taking direction from someone, who looks like me and is so much younger than them. And I think that even though there's things like, that could wrinkle, right, for some people.
They learned though, right? They learned.
Well, I think part of that is, really trying to listen and understand where others are coming from, and then really knowing what is it that I'm trying to do? What is my goal? And in each of the jobs I had, I was pretty focused on what I thought I could accomplish. And I just kind of try to stay very singularly focused on those accomplishments and let some of the noise just fade in the background. And I didn't try to take on every single fight,
right?
And a lot of these jobs are about relationships. And you'll remember, for those of you in graduate school who study negotiation theory, right, there's different types of negotiation styles. And one of them is if you and I are negotiating right now, and I know I'm never seeing you again, I can afford to burn all my bridges with you, right?
Right. You're not a repeat player.
Right, but almost all of these are repeat negotiations. So building your capital, being good at what you do and letting that speak for itself, and then and then you got to have tough skin. I think some of that is also you just have to let things, not rise to every time you're heckled, and just let it go.
Yeah. So then Nurani asks, did any diplomat ever figure out that you're an Ismaili Muslim, and what impact that have, if any, on sort of your conversations with folks?
I think, because of the world we occupy, especially in diplomacy, there's just so few Muslims that was, and people get really excited. I started to say, I spent a lot of time in Central Asia and South Asia, and, largely, not exclusively, but largely Muslim countries. And they would just be so surprised when I was part of a delegation, or if I was leading a delegation, that the U.S. had, someone who was Muslim on their team. This was always just oh, and they would get so excited if they could say assalamu alaikum, or if we could speak a few words in Dari, or in Arabic, or in Urdu or Hindi, or a local language. And not that I speak all of them, but I know enough introductory. And just the fact that we could understand a little bit more about where they were coming from, where their cultures were coming from, they would just get so excited, right? It's such a change. And I would hear a lot from their teams also about, they were largely all male, and so the fact that not only, was I Muslim, but that, to be a female Muslim working in largely male Muslim countries can also be this big shock to the system. And also, I think education, it's both ways that, your women also have a voice to play, that they're not just the chaiwalas or the secretaries. That they can also play prominent roles in your society and in your foreign policy or international development. So yeah, we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah. So, Aslam Balani asks whether you have to be proficient in a foreign language to work at the State Department. I want to expand that into this question of, so let's say you've got people on the phone and on the line and on the webinar who are like, look, I want to have your career, but I'm either mid-career or I'm just finishing school right now. What do I do tomorrow or next week? What is the thing I need to do? Right? Do I need to go take a foreign language? Do I work on a campaign? Do I go get an internship on the Hill or in the State Department? Like, what do I do if I want to be you and I've got some time tomorrow or next week?
So I think there's no easy formula for any of this, because none of us plotted our careers, right? It's really easy to like put this together and put your resume together now and say, I did this and this and this, just the same way you can say, or, you know, many of us can say, but none of us started out saying, this is what we're going to do, right? And we didn't know what roads and twists and turns. So what I would say is do what you're passionate about doing. So if you wanted to take a foreign language because you're passionate about learning a foreign language, go learn it and go master it. If you're doing it because you think it's the right thing to do, you're not going to be very good at it, I bet, you know? So don't waste your time. If you're really interested in studying business administration, go study business administration, right?
Yeah.
If you have a passion to work for local campaigns or national campaigns, go knock on doors and work on campaigns. Follow your passion and see where that takes you, instead of trying to work backwards and say like, well, I want to end up here, so I'm gonna, because life and a lot of these careers aren't like that. I think for me, the focus has never been so much like the sector. I mean, I'm all over the place. I've done foreign policy and national security, and now I'm doing international development. It's not so much the sector for me, it's the mission. And for me, the mission has always been public service. It's always been public service. And it just can take so many different forms of how you do that. And it, you know, for me, most of my career has been at the international. I could totally see myself flipping at some point and saying, I'm going to work at a local level, and I'm going to try to help fix local communities here. I don't have to travel all the way overseas to do that. We have problems right here at home. So I would say follow your passion. If people give you opportunities that maybe aren't what you're thinking, but could be totally interesting and off script, take a chance and take a look at them. And see where that takes you. And then just don't be afraid. I think we are sometimes, you know, we worry so much about, well, we have to make a certain income, or we have to do this, or we have to have all these securities built in. You know, as long as you have enough of a safety net, you need a little bit of a safety net to be able to do this, but try to take a chance, try to take a risk, and follow like what motivates you, because that will help you see it through, you know. And
well, so let me ask you about that. So, you know, I can just hear, because I hear you saying that, and I think to myself, and I'm trying to think of what people on the line are hearing, and like, how do I tell my parents, like, I'm going to go follow my passion, right? I'm going to go work in some low-paying job at the State Department when I could go work at Deloitte and make, you know, big money and pay off my loans. And like, how do I explain this to my parents?
Yeah, no, it's tough. You know, I mean, without disclosing my income, my first jobs, when we got married, and we had a one income salary when I was at the State Department. I mean, we had to live 60 miles away to afford rent, you know. We made no money, but it was like my dream job at the time. You know, here's what I'd say though, Jamil, and I know we have to wrap up, but here's what I would say. I think this is a moment in 2020, and as we enter 2021, where globally and nationally, this is a moment where there's never been a more important time for public service. And there's never been a more important time for us to get involved. Our democracy is so important here in the United States and all around the world. Democracy only works if we invest in it. And that can be in government, it can be in civil society, it could be in the private sector. There's so many different ways to protect our democracy, to think about our ethos of faith and public service. Wherever you are in your life, whatever you're doing in your career, there is a way for you to contribute. There's a way for your kids to contribute. And it's only going to work if we do it. And we are so incredibly blessed to have all of these resources. We had this network at our table, right? I mean, it took me like 10 years to figure out what the word network even meant. And now we have this incredible network, you know, all over the place. Use it, connect with it, be blessed by it, and then repay it, right? For those that come next. But it's our responsibility to invest in our democracy here and in every country around the world, and to make sure that our institutions work for our people. Yeah. And I think that is a call to action for all of us. And wherever we are in our careers or our lives, there's just such an important role that we have to play right now. Yeah. And I think we all know we can't sit on the sidelines anymore.
Yeah. No, Fatima, that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for all what you've done for the country, for our community. Thank you for talking to us tonight. I want to remind folks in the audience, we've got over 120 people with us tonight. Next, 2 weeks from now, Noreen Qasim will be with us. She's traveled around the world with presidents, secretaries of various branches, July 2nd. And then we'll have Judge Halim Dalandina on July 16th, talk about his role in the California Court of Appeals. Don't forget to do your census. And if you want mentorship, if you want to talk to some of the people that we've had on this program, you want to talk to me about what you want to do in your career, put some notes, take the survey at the end, put in the notes that you want to talk to us. We'll reach out to you. We'll get connected with you. We are here to help. Let us know. Thank you all for coming. Fatima, thanks again for doing this. And we'll see you guys all in 2 weeks for Noreen Qasim. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.